I'm here today with Scott Anderson, who is in Ashland, Oregon. It's the 1st of December 2019 where he is, and the 2nd of December here in Mullumbimby. And uh, living in the future as I do. So Scott, I've known you for 25 years, I would guess.
Yes.
And, you have
And I've
continued.
known about you for probably an extra 8 or 9 years in addition.
A lurker, huh?
From the time of your prevention articles in prevention.
Oh, yeah, that was 76. Yeah,
That's getting back there.
yeah, yeah. And when I met you, it was like you came up to our place in Kamshi for a professional consultation, but clearly you were a different order of connection, and we became fast friends, and you have influenced me in many ways since then. Just thinking most notably
Hopefully for the better.
the Generations material that you turned me on to back in the 90s.
Yeah.
Continue to find very valuable. But
It's surprising how many people are still talking about that stuff.
yeah, and they've adopted the Gen X, Gen Z, all that, millennials in particular.
Mm-hmm.
But let's go back to in finding out who you are and why, which is my goal today. Let's go back to your origins of where were you born?
Origins. I was born in New York City.
Wow.
Right at the base of the George Washington Bridge, what used to be Women's Lying-In Hospital, if I'm not mistaken, and became Columbia Presbyterian in later years.
Yeah.
And that was when, shortly after my father had been stationed to Valencia, Spain, to open a consulate there, he sent my mother back across the ocean 9 months pregnant to have me in New York, not having full confidence in the Spanish medical system.
What year was that?
1946.
Okay, so the war was over, but your dad was a high up government person then, if he's starting.
No, I mean he was a State Department. He was a career diplomat. And he had been sent from his previous post, which had been, let's see, at that point, his previous post had been in Bogota, where he had met my mother and fallen in love and had got transferred before I was actually born. Got transferred to Valencia before I was actually born.
Is your mother Colombian?
No. She was Stanford grad. Went to Katie Gibbs Secretarial School. Applied to the State Department to work in the State Department as a secretary. Got shipped off to Bogota, Colombia, to be my father's secretary.
Okay. So, what are your earliest memories of leaning towards the health field, and when did you decide to become a doctor?
Well, if the picture can be painted broadly, I think one of the things that I was able to enjoy and did enjoy a great deal growing up was time in nature, which I found wonderful. And so my natural curiosity was piqued by, nature and how to, animals and plants and all the things that were to be found in the various environments that I grew up in as we were transferred from one part of the world to another.
You got a lot of exposure.
So when it came time to sort of specialize, let's say, my father was encouraged by his own superiors in the State Department to take advantage of the tremendous growth in interest in science. And he himself had thought of becoming a doctor when he was a young man growing up in the Depression. and would have probably been a doctor if that had been a career opportunity for him. But he was from a family that didn't have that opportunity, and he was able to get into the State Department, and that was his way out of the Depression. Was basically a career as a diplomat.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he saw something in me of himself that wasn't able to be expressed, and so he encouraged me in the sciences. And we had all kinds of things, a chemistry set and the microscope set, and time in nature, trying to identify plants and all that kind of stuff that encouraged my nascent interest in science. So when it came time for me to go to school, that was it was really my first love. I say that science really was my first love, just learning about how things are and the science, all the incredible things that are known about plants and animals and the world and planets and stars. And I had a telescope when I was 13. At Christmas, I got a telescope and would spend endless hours gazing at the heavens through this telescope. And so I was a budding young scientist. And this was also, of course, the time when Sputnik came along, and in the late 1950s, just as I was turning 11 or 12. And so there was this huge national upsurge of interest in science. And so it was very natural for me to actually get into science and to go into conceive of somehow my ending up as a scientist of one sort or another.
And were you having a lot of different high schools, moving around, or?
No. Again, on the encouragement of one of his superiors, my father saw his way clear to encourage me to get into a college preparatory school, a prep school, so as to have the best possible chance of getting into a really good institution of higher learning, maybe even an Ivy League school. And even though my performance in the early years, I just barely squeaked into being admitted into this prep school.
Which school?
Groton School.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sort of a famous elite Ivy League outfit. Well, I was kind of a bit of an odd duck, because whereas most of my classmates had grown up on the East Coast and were all terribly savvy about everything, sort of social on the East Coast and the upper echelons, I was this kind of weirdo who'd grown up in different places around the world and didn't wear the right kind of clothes and that kind of stuff. But at Groton, we had excellent teachers, and including excellent science teachers. And so I was able to get advanced placement in math and physics and English, and get into Harvard and actually begin a career ostensibly in science by getting an undergraduate degree in science. So that was the beginning.
So then from Harvard to medical school?
Well, interestingly, while I was at Harvard, my last year at Harvard, I met Swami Satchidananda. So my trajectory was interrupted. My scientific trajectory was interrupted by meeting what is known in the Indo-Tibetan tradition as an extraordinary being. Swami Satchidananda was an extraordinary being. And I don't need to go into the details, but he made a very deep impression on me, and I wanted to try to find a way to integrate my scientific interest with my new love, which was yoga, in the way that he communicated it, which was very down home and very real. And he encouraged me to do both, to maintain some kind of connection with my scientific interest and also to practice yoga. So that's what basically I've been doing ever since.
Did you spend time at Yogaville, or how did you?
No, Yogaville hadn't been established. Excuse me. No, let me correct that. When would it have been? 1972, maybe, the Integral Yoga Institute established Yogaville East, which was in Pomfret, Connecticut.
Oh,
And so by 1970, when was it? 1972 or 73, by the time I got to Connecticut, Yogaville East was up and running, a going concern, old rundown mansion turned into a giant ashram full of vegetarian yogis, and I was living with my wife and oldest child down the street, and I had found a job at the University of Connecticut just half an hour down the road, where I was working in electron microscopy. Excuse me, I was working in bacterial genetics, having applied for a job in electron microscopy, which I'd done in San Francisco before, while I was living at the Yoga Institute.
now this is before medical school?
Yes, and it was while I was living there in Pomfret, Connecticut, that after I'd actually was about halfway through a master's degree in genetics at the University of Connecticut, when Swamiji suggested, well, what about medical school? And that ended up being the seed that the following year led to my entering medical school. And the idea in my mind, excuse me?
Go ahead.
The idea in my mind was that I got very interested I was taken with the notion that what I was experiencing in my yoga practice, in terms of the postures and the dietary change and the lifestyle change and all the aspects of it, could someday potentially be described and understood scientifically. And the only way I could see to kind of pursue that interest would be to learn human biology in detail. And after extensive search around through college catalogs, particularly for graduate programs, wherein I might learn human biology, it seemed like it was an open and shut case that your best bet would be to become a physician if you're interested in human biology.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the big sort of deciding factor, you might say, in that choice, rather than to try to go into, like, let's say, physiology or an academic field studying aspects of human biology, but which didn't have the kind of integrated approach that you learn in medical school, a more comprehensive approach, including the anatomy and the physiology and the pharmacology and all the stuff that you learn in med school.
Mm. Now, another coincidence, possibly I didn't remember if we had it, is what year did you graduate from Harvard? 69?
I was in the class of 68, but I stayed an extra year as an advanced placement student in a fourth year of residence. So I didn't actually graduate. I didn't actually go through the whole graduation process. I elected to not graduate until, except with the class of 1969.
So we were within a few miles of each other. I was in Back Bay going to Tufts Medical, and I was a member of the Harvard Square Unitarian Church. So I'd come over the square.
So that's where in 1969, my first wife and I were married.
You're kidding, Ralph Halverson?
No, excuse me. No, I'm confusing the two. The Unitarian Church was where I sponsored a talk. I organized a talk to be given by Swami Satchidananda. And it was an Episcopal church, sort of around the corner and up the street a little ways, where my first wife and I got married. She was in the class behind me at Radcliffe.
And now you're off to medical school where?
University of Connecticut.
That's in Hartford?
So I was living in Connecticut. By the time it comes around for me to apply to medical school, I'm a resident of Connecticut.
You were, so let's pick up with, you were in Connecticut already.
Yeah, I was living in Connecticut. I told you how we ended up living in Pomfret, Connecticut, just a few miles down from Yogaville East. And while I worked at the University of Connecticut in bacterial genetics, which is how I ended up in getting a master's degree there in genetics. And by that time I was pushing 30, and none of the medical schools I was interested in going to would even look at somebody who was my age. Plus the tuition costs for any of the medical schools that seemed reasonable to even think about were really quite substantial.
Yeah.
So I was very
Spiral.
fortunate. I was very fortunate to get into the University of Connecticut, where as a Connecticut resident,
Yeah.
the cost of medical school was very reasonable, and it was a brand new medical school in Farmington with brand new facilities and, you know, a brand new sort of state-of-the-art curriculum, and, you know, just a fantastic complex there in Farmington to go to medical school. It was a fantastic place to be in medical school.
That sure sounds better than Tufts, that was an old clothing factory downtown Boston.
Yeah.
Before they built the new one. So you're in medical school, and what usually happens by middle of sophomore year is all the idealism is beaten out of you by the overwhelming culture of domination that is so rampant in the older medical schools. It sounds like you had a breath of fresh air of being in a new school, and you've already gotten all this background in yoga and a much more holistic worldview, and you didn't come in straight out of school, so you've had some.
Right. So that was the second factor, and then the third factor was that I was a dad with 2 kids, you know,
Oh,
wife
wow.
and 2 kids. So my second child, my second daughter, was born my first week of medical school.
Wow.
So I got notified somehow, you know, oh, I know. No, my wife went into labor in the middle of the night, and we took her to the hospital, and I went and told my class director or whatever it was that I was going to be occupied for a day or so, you know, as a father. And just down the hall from the medical school, the hospital was attached, and so I could literally walk from one part of the medical school right into the hospital where my daughter was born by C-section, first week of med school.
So then you finished 4 years. I'm moving this along here to internship, residency. What?
Well, I managed to work because I was watching my pennies. I didn't take summers off in med school. I was able to take electives throughout the 3 summers that qualified me to basically complete all the requirements for the MD degree in December of my 4th year of medical school.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of going through the whole match process that they had back then, I don't know if you went through.
I remember that.
It's a very complicated process that had
Yeah.
a tremendous amount of anxiety associated with it. And instead of that, I just called up a couple of potential residency programs where I wanted to live, somewhere in Northern California, and the one in Davis said, "Yeah, come on down. We got a place for you. We'll make you a psychiatric resident." So I became a psychiatric resident in Davis. Moved my family to at the Sacramento Medical Center, University of California Medical Center in Sacramento, and we lived with we moved the family to Davis, and so I was commuting to my internship in psychiatry in Sacramento.
Interesting. Wow, you've really know how to work the system there, Scott. I'm impressed. So I can see your holism background, but how did this transpire into your becoming one of the early holistic docs, and in Marin County, no less, and San Francisco?
Well, during the years that I was in medical school, early in my just months before I started medical school, I underwent a whole sort of spiritual conversion thing and became a student of Bubba Friedan, corresponding student. So the whole time I was in medical school, I was a corresponding student of Bubba Friedan. Mm-hmm. And the doctors in that community, of whom there were half a dozen, um, encouraged me to kind of be the research guy, because I was there in a medical school where I had full access to a medical library and all the resources there, whereas they were working up in Lake County, California, where they didn't have those kind of research
Yeah.
availability. And so I
And
became
no
the
internet.
research guy. I became the research guy for
Ah.
the community, for the community docs and their clinic.
Mhm.
And that function continued for 25 years. I was the research guy. And a lot of the questions were about holistic medicine issues as they came up clinically with members of the community and as they were raised with the doctors by Bubba Friedjohn himself. He would constantly be asking questions about his health, about the health of some of his ladies, and about his students, and how are they going to get educated, and what's the best way to eat, and what's the best way, you know, what's the best kind of vitamins to take. So it was this open-ended consideration on healthy lifestyle that would be supportive of the sort of community and spiritual process that he engages in. And so I had a kind of intensive in holistic health on top of my 8 years with Swami Satchidananda, which, you know, included living in the alternative countercultural community in San Francisco, where, you know, where the natural health movement was very strong. You had the first health food stores, you know, in the mid 70s, if I recall correctly, or no, the early 70s. One of the very first being opened by another student of Swami Satchidananda. So there was lots of holistic health was in the air during all those years. And then when I get to medical school, I'm the research guy for mostly holistic health issues for the Adi Da community. And then when I got out and actually went into my, I got into that internship that I mentioned in psychiatry. And after doing that for a year, which included 6 months of medicine and 6 months of psychiatry, I was qualified to get my license. And I started fishing around for the possibility of a job and found that there was a job just down the road a piece where I would be paid like 5 times what I would be paid if I stayed as a resident.
Ah, and what was the job and where?
It was at the Yolo County Hospital in Woodland, California.
Oh, good old Woodland.
Yeah. So it was, in many ways, it was my favorite time, my, you know, the most wonderful time, because I had 2 nurses assigned to me full time. One of them spoke fluent Spanish. The other one had been around forever and who knew everything of how to do everything. And so everything was just like this. And a lot of my patients were Spanish speaking, so I got to use my Spanish. And so it was a really fun time. It was like 4 days a week after busting my ass as an intern, you know, 70 hours a week. This was now suddenly a whole other way of living.
And you're doing primary care?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And then
And
how did that morph into your being?
So then a year later, I got invited up to Lake County. One of the community docs in the Adi Dam community wanted to move to Marin, and he saw me as a good replacement for himself, and he just said, "Come, take over my patients."
Oh.
So I went up to Lake County, and after some hemming and hawing on the part of the family, we all moved to Lake County in when was it? 82, I think it was, 81 or 82. And I became a, you know, GP in a community GP, a rural GP with, you know, every third night on call and every third weekend on call and 70-hour weeks and 4 or 5 patients in the hospital all the time.
And this was
On the job training.
Primarily for the Adi Da community, or?
No, this was in the Clear Lake community.
Oh, okay. So
the Adi Da community was only several hundred people at the time.
Yeah, I thought it wouldn't be that big. Yeah.
No. So there were a number of us docs, community, Adidam community doctors who practiced in the Clear Lake area to make a living.
We should probably mention that Dafrijan became Adi Da at this point.
Yes, right. That when he passed away in 2008, he was known as Adi Da Samraj.
Yeah. So you're there doing primary care again, not under the great conditions you had in Woodland, but
that's right. That's right. It was much more stressful because I'm, full bore, 5 days a week in the office, seeing patients, 3 to 5 patients in the hospital all the time. Every third night on call. Trips by, midnight trips to the ER to admit patients. So that was
when I met you in the 90s, and you were in San Francisco and Marin, right?
Yeah. So that was we're fast forwarding now a decade.
Oh wow!
From
yeah.
Early 80s to the early 90s. After 6 years in Clear Lake, I moved to the East Coast. Moved my family to the East Coast because it was obvious that the girls needed better school situation than they had available in Clear Lake. My daughters. So we moved to the East Coast near Washington, D.C., and I got another GP job working in Manassas at Manassas, California, Manassas, Virginia, in Northern Virginia.
Mm.
And after a few years of that, I decided, there was a whole lot of things going on in my relationship with my wife, and my older daughter was off in a school that was run by Adidam. My younger daughter was getting ready to graduate from, she ended up going to local high school, and my first wife and I separated, and I moved into the local Adida ashram there in Potomac, Maryland. And so there was a lot of changes going on at that point, but I ended up leaving primary care and retooling as a alternative doc, with the help of a very experienced chelation clinic in Northern Virginia, where I became one of the physicians on staff, learning chelation on the job, learning nutrition intensively, including, conferences where, continuing education was offered, and chelation therapy and nutritional support and all kinds of medical interventions or nutritional medicine intervention.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, when I started listening to Jeffrey Bland and learning about metabolic update and getting into the details of nutritional biochemistry as best I could in the middle of a busy practice. And so that was,
you must have run
that was when we met, when I had recently begun being a holistic doc in Marin.
Yeah. So how did you get back to Marin from Northern Virginia?
How did I get back to Marin from Northern Virginia? Well, after my first wife and I separated, I met Susan Potash, my second wife, and we came to an agreement that as soon as my younger daughter had finished high school there in Fairfax and was into college, had been admitted and set up and was, all ready to go in college, that we would move back to the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we did. She got admitted to the University of Virginia, and we actually drove her and her kit and caboodle to the first day of her freshman year. And literally the next day we were on our way driving across country to go back to our beloved California.
And I was in Charlottesville from 96. This sounds like it was a little before 96, but we were just.
It was 94. It was 94 when we made this transcontinental move.
Yeah. Wow. And I was about to get that. Now, did you run into Terry Chappell when you were doing chelation?
Sure. No, I didn't get to know him personally. I was, kind of, I think technically the field of chelation had been pretty well established for a period of maybe 15 to 20 years before I got into it. So by the time
Yeah.
I got into it, there was a well-established educational program for chelating docs run through the American Academy for the Advances in Medicine, which had been previously the Academy of Medical Preventics, which had
Yes.
been founded in Sacramento by Gary.
Yeah, Gary. I remember him.
Gary, what's his last name? Anyway, he was the guy who sort of began to organize chelating docs into a kind of
Yeah.
medical association, which was what ACAM became, and it was
Yeah.
a fantastic way to learn chelation therapy and to take advantage of the experience of all these somewhat older docs who had done hundreds and thousands of chelations and had sort of formalized all kinds of details on how to do it safely and how to monitor people and how to be effective as a chelation doc.
So you moved back to Marin.
Moved back to Marin and found a slot working with two different holistic docs.
Elson, one of them.
Elson Haas at the Preventive Medical Center in Marin. The Marin Preventive Medical Center was called. He, long established guy. I flew out from the East Coast and made arrangements to meet with him, and we got along fine. And he said, "Yeah, come on, and we can set you up with at least a couple days a week of work and his multi-practitioner clinic there in San Rafael." And then the fellow whose practice I'd taken over from Clear Lake by that time had a very active chelation practice in San Francisco called the San Francisco Preventive Medical Center, if I recall correctly. And he also offered me a couple of days work a week working in chelation, which I was already very familiar with. And so I ended up working in other doctors' practices, and that became so congenial for me personally because I never wanted to run a medical practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so being a paid, producer in someone else's medical practice worked great for me. And it gave me the flexibility to switch. So I ended up working for Paul Lin in San Francisco and Elson Haas in San Rafael for a number of years. And then another pioneer by the name of Jeffrey Anderson, who had,
Oh yeah, I knew Jeffrey. We almost went into practice together when I started the Wellness Center.
Right.
Yeah.
So Jeffrey's been around forever.
Yeah.
And he had been medically impacted by one of the things that he and Marty Rossman did. Marty Rossman? No, Michael Rosenbaum. He and Michael Rosenbaum did attempted to do a medical mitigation program at a big, huge toxic spill up in
Richmond, wasn't
it? Somewhere in the Richmond area. And both of them ended up getting sick. Mm-hmm. Both of them ended up getting sick as a result.
And Michael's died since then, I think.
Michael's died, and I don't know. I haven't heard from Jeffrey. He was a very private guy then, and he's been a very private guy ever since. But he did coach me to basically take over his practice. And at that point, what his practice consisted of was a huge filing cabinet with 300 active patients with chronic fatigue, multiple chemical sensitivity, environmental illness, and myofascial syndrome.
Wow.
Boy. So that was intense. So I had another very intense learning experience with Jeff Anderson because we would see patients together for months until I really felt comfortable with how he operated with them. And then he was continually stepping back to be more and more solicitous of his own health, which had all kinds of problems.
Sick, I heard.
Yes, he was.
Yeah. So this was another office that he had in San Rafael?
He had an office in Corte Madera.
Uh-huh.
And so at one point, I cut back my San Francisco practice to 1 day a week, working 2 days a week in San Rafael, and 1 day a week with Jeff in his office, trying to basically maintain this patient load that he had of chronic illness patients that he had taken responsibility for.
Wow.
So that was intense.
What
And
kind of success
then
did you have with them? What were you, I mean,
I
that's,
felt like I was running to catch up most of the time. You know,
mhm.
I was reading as much as I could, given that I had these other responsibilities. And I was still, you know, on call all the time for research issues from the Adidas community. And so there was a lot going on. And learning what I discovered in these later years of my involvement in clinical nutritional and holistic and functional medicine was just how complicated it can get.
Yeah.
And the answer is very complicated. So anyway, I was an active member of the Bay Area Alternative Physicians group, which would meet routinely about once a month, and we would get together and share war stories. Often one of us would give a lecture, or somebody would be invited to come in from outside. You know, a guy, director of one of the alternative clinical labs, for example, might be invited to come in. So I got to know a bunch of other guys in addition to Elson and Paul Lynn and Michael Rosenbaum and Jeff Anderson and a little bit Marty Rossman. We didn't have, our paths didn't cross very much with Marty, but I got to know a number of the other guys, including Dick Cunnion, who was sort of a doctor's doctor, holistic doctor's doctor.
Never heard of him.
Dick Cunnion was the founder of the Orthomolecular Health Medicine Society. His
Uh-huh.
name is spelled a little peculiar. It's Kunin, pronounced Cunnion.
Uh-huh.
He had been a board certified psychiatrist.
Yeah, orthomolecular came out of psychiatry, didn't it?
Psychiatrist. He had been a board certified psychiatrist with an active psychiatry practice, and he got very interested in hypnosis. And he was very active in trying to get use hypnosis in his practice back in the 80s. And that didn't go over very well with the authorities, who felt that, you know, particularly the California authorities, who felt that hypnosis was not really standard of care in psychiatry. And simultaneously, as I understand it, I'm kind of putting a story together here to make it understandable. His 4-year-old son got deathly ill. And in the course of trying to understand what was going on with his son, he discovered what we could call orthomolecular medicine, or biochemical medicine, or nutritional medicine, or functional medicine, but has had many different names, you know, where you're really trying to dig into what's going on a molecular level with people in their various health conditions. So Dick, being an incredibly brilliant guy, ended up, you know, being a powerhouse of innovation in the field of orthomolecular medicine, and tried to get orthomolecular medicine on the map, tried to get it approved by the California Medical Association for CME credits, and they were like this the whole time.
Yeah, yeah.
So he had an Orthomolecular Health Medicine Association, which ended up being small and very sort of intimate, because he couldn't get CME authorization from the California State Medical Association. And so it was a very voluntary kind of thing for people who were really serious about networking on the issues of molecular medicine, let's call it.
This is bringing back lots of memories from, it was going on in parallel with my work in wellness, and I was aware of it, but it wasn't, because it's the treatment paradigm, I wasn't.
That's right. That's right.
But you're naming all these characters that were around me, like Milton Estes and Jeff Anderson were just down the road from me in Miller Avenue, and I think they parted ways, and when Jeff went off in his direction. But now I'd forgotten all about orthomolecular. That was a big term in those days.
So that was Linus Pauling's coinage.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yes, that was a term that he coined in an article that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1969, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
And so during all the years of the 70s and the 80s, there were small numbers of physicians who got excited about Pauling's concept of orthomolecular medicine, including Dick Cunyon in the Bay Area. And he tried to, turn that into a movement, and it would have been a movement if it hadn't been basically undermined by the California Medical Association.
Yeah.
It would have been a stronger movement, let me put it that way.
A what movement?
A stronger movement.
Yeah.
If the docs can get CME credits for attending orthomolecular health medicine conferences, it'll attract a lot more docs.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So we had holistic medicine, we had orthomolecular, had Jeff Brand come along with functional yet. I identify him as naming functional medicine, but I'm not even sure if it originated with him. And then we had...
I don't remember exactly who originated the term, but he definitely used the term. He started out with using the term metabolic update.
Mm-hmm.
So he produced a long series of monthly audio tapes for practitioners, where he would do a kind of a focus on a particular new scientific finding in the biochemical, physiological literature, and he would then interview docs who were doing innovative things. And so every month he had a very interesting series, which went from being the metabolic update through maybe at least another intermediate change, and it ended up being the functional medicine update.
Mm-hmm.
So he adopted the term, whether he originated it or not, I don't know.
And all of these pioneers that were challenging the big pharma chokehold that has only gotten more choking of late, and yet integrative medicine is a term that seems to have gotten some credibility. It's, you're not a pariah completely.
So the trick there is, as I see it, is that the idea became, okay, well, let's see if we can't integrate the best of holistic care with mainstream medicine and do it on evidence base. And there was, the establishment of the Office of Alternative Medicine, which then eventually became the National Institute for Complementary and Alternative Medicine. Mm-hmm. So there was this sort of gradual seeming legitimization of alternative medicine. And from my perspective, what it was a progressive co-opting of the public interest in alternative medicine, and by making sure that all the really powerful therapies were eliminated.
And what was that statistic that came out of more health dollars were being spent on alternative than, do you remember that?
Yes. Yeah. That was the Eisenberg study. Uh-huh. David Eisenberg from Harvard was funded by the Fetzer Foundation to do this study of a survey of alternative health, actual use of alternative health by Americans, and he came up with these amazing findings that just whet the appetite of the mainstream insurance companies and the administrators. Let's see, well, how can we get a piece of that action? And so I think it was out of that you ended up with all the major universities and university hospitals and training centers ended up over the subsequent 10 or 15 years with integrative programs.
Yeah, I got invited to a guest lecture at the one at Virginia Commonwealth, the UVA Medical School in Richmond. And there were like 6 students showed up early one morning, and they clearly, it was a sham. I don't know how it was in other medical schools, whether they even continued it or not. But
I think there's a lot of it that's been continued, let's say, via lip servicing.
Mm-hmm.
Because the public is very interested in alternative medicine and alternative modalities, non-medical therapies. And so the big medical organizations have set up these integrative centers where they can advertise all the holistic things that they offer. But when you actually get there and you talk with the docs are basically practicing mainstream medicine with occasional referral to, let's say, the nutritionist or the stress manager or the whatever, without really modifying. In my impression, I may be kind of have a cynical eye on this, but that's my impression, is that it's pretty much paying lip service to the alternative modalities.
And co-opted in the same way that wellness got co-opted in the 80s. They watered down and Now we have Andy Weil, the sort of granddaddy figure of all this, pretty much out on his own, though he does have a fellowship. Then there was a program at Duke, I'm just remembering, that one of the Metadocs was involved with. I think it was Duke, yeah.
So Jack, one of the things that happened that really blew my mind in the mid-90s, not right around the time that you and I first actually met physically, was at one of the ACAM conferences where the chelation docs would get together. Mm-hmm. I met a guy who was running the California Citizens for Health program. And the California Citizens for Health was recently off of a major victory, which was the passage of the Dietary Health Supplement Act of 1990, something or other. And he was identifying, he could talk in a very knowledgeable way about the politics of alternative medicine. And he directed me to a book called Assault on Medical Freedom by Joseph P. Lisa, which had just been published and then had just been banned by legal action on the part of Stephen Barrett and John Renner, famous quackbusters, the original quackbusters. So the book that basically unveiled the literal conspiracy to suppress alternative medicine, they managed to get banned through a libel statute. Very common trick. It's been used a lot since.
I didn't know we could ban books.
Yep. They managed to get the publisher to stop publishing it and to, go and collect all the books that were in the warehouse and destroy them. And so it became a book that was hard to get for a long time. Nowadays, you can find copies used primarily on the internet at Amazon, but it tells the story of what the sort of revelation was at that point that opened my eyes to what was going on in alternative medicine vis-a-vis mainstream medicine, and how there was an organized nationwide conspiracy to suppress alternative medicine.
And how did you personally experience this with your practice? Were you in?
It made me much more careful. It made me much more careful. And so I was very sort of cautious about getting into, really weird and innovative things. I was trying to keep my records clean and keep my nose clean and, just do things pretty much by the book, even though I was still practicing what was in effect alternative medicine. I was trying to be a good primary care doc first and foremost, and make sure that I didn't miss things medically. And it was only some years later when I had a medical mishap with one of my patients at the Fasting Medical Center, this was now 2002, so we're now moving into the next decade.
Mm-hmm.
At which point I had left my San Francisco connection and had moved up to Ukiah and was basically migrating northward and maintaining just a minimal presence down in Marin 1 day a week for quite a while, trying to get my patients from Elson's place that I had accumulated, settled with new physicians and happy in their new situation. And then I moved up to Santa Rosa and worked at the fasting center, Alan Goldhammer's Preventive Medical Center.
I didn't realize that. Interesting.
I was the medical director of one of the few therapeutic water-only fasting medically supervised inpatient places in the world for 4 years.
Interesting. My friend lived right near there and he used to walk by the place, but I didn't know that it was there until some years later when a student of mine living in Perth was involved, and he told me about it. I looked it up, and wow, it was right down the street from my friend Alan's house. And you were
so
there
Alan Goldhammer, who's a chiropractor, learned fasting as a therapeutic intervention from an Australian who was a pioneer in the field of fasting in the larger school of natural hygiene.
Ah,
and I forget the name of the Australian. I never met him, but he had fasted thousands of patients and really knew how to do it and do it well. And that's how Alan learned to do fasting supervision with inpatients. So these were people who would come and live at the fasting center for periods of a week, 10 days, 3 weeks, a month, sometimes 6 weeks. And they would fast for anything from 3 days to 30 days. Water only. So that was I saw that as sort of the culmination of my medical career. Because it was from your sound is cut out.
Oh, you mentioned a mishap that happened.
Yeah, so one of my fasting patients had a medical mishap, I call it. And the family got all bent out of shape and reported me to the state medical board, and they filed a malpractice lawsuit that we settled out of court, and I agreed to happily retire from medicine. It was a perfect timing for me.
And then you moved to that beautiful acreage outside of Ukiah. It was near
we were already living in Ukiah.
But on that property, or
on that property. So we built the home there broke ground in 1999, and it was finished and ready to move into in 2000. That was our Y2K getaway.
Yeah. So, wow, what a trip.
Yep.
And in retirement, you still keep your fingers in the pie?
So in retirement, I went from being a physician for a number of people to being, in effect, a patient advocate for Susan's father and my mother, both of whom were showing serious signs. And I think you met my mother when she was in the lodge at Paulin Creek in Santa Rosa.
Yes, I remember that.
Right. So not long after that, she had an acute episode of spinal stenosis and had to have what all the docs said was required spinal surgery. And she got, the surgical wound got infected with coliforms, and she developed a long series of complications that eventuated in Clostridia difficile poisoning and her death as a result. And meanwhile, no sooner had she died than Susan's father in New York is no longer ambulatory. And so we fly to New York and take care of him for 6 weeks in his last days.
Mm.
So this was full-time work for me, at least it felt that way, as sort of caregiver and patient advocate for both of them, on the phone every day, you know, trying to juggle docs and referrals and medications and refills and all that insanity for both aging parents, from our little getaway in Ukiah, with frequent trips to Santa Rosa and frequent trips to New York.
And then
so that took us through 2006, when they both died in 2005. And so a year later, I felt I was beginning to recover, and I was then starting to generate the Yoga Science Foundation.
And that's been your passion fulfilled now, as you're able to devote time to it. And
exactly. So it's, you know, coming all these years later, the sort of culmination of my early adult ideas about how the tools of science could be used to study the spiritual process,
mm-hmm.
which I had experienced as having a lot to do with the body.
Mm. I'm reminded of a recent little presentation I did on the work of, that was triggered by Max Planck's statement that he thought that consciousness informed matter. And then I remembered reading, what's his name, the Hungarian Laszlo, Erwin
Yes.
Laszlo stuff on
Yes.
the Akashic field and quantum mechanics, and how
Yes.
that merges together. So it sounds like a similar blending of two what have been considered separate realms, but really aren't, opposite
Right.
sides.
Exactly. Exactly.
So you're doing it more with the body and yoga and.
Well, actually, the body is what we have scientific access to.
Mm-hmm.
But the mind is really the target of the research.
Yeah.
And trying to understand the relationship between those two is a high koanic for science.
That's a quotable quote. Did you just make that up?
Well, high koanic, I'm trying to remember who came up with that. That might have been one of Adi Da's lines. High koanic.
And I'm just
guaranteed to flush your ideas right out. All those accumulated toxic ideas you have will give you a high koanic.
So there's all these fields of endeavor that were under the radar for the most part in the 70s and 80s, and coming into the radar, but in much watered down phases. And there was another arena that that we haven't mentioned that has gotten more favor. One of Metadocs, Elliot Dasher, was early into the mind body, but they were calling it
psychoneuroimmunology.
Yeah.
So that was the child of some basic research by Candace Pert and some other famous people who were able to identify molecular effects of psychological processes.
Right. So we got all of these things intertwined and yet not that organized. And
well, not so easy to organize. And I would say even that the effort to organize it has been actively opposed by those who don't want it to be organized. Because if it did get organized, it might actually provide an effective opposition to the prevailing materialist paradigm.
Yeah, yeah. We can't have that.
Can't have that.
So in our mature years, where do you think things are going? What do you predict?
Well, it seems like things are simultaneously going up and down.
Yeah.
The down part is the obvious devastation that's occurring in our society, in our economy, in our United States political arena, in our world in general, and in our ecosystem. Obvious devastation taking place. And at the same time, there's a steady growth of interest in what I would like to think of as the radical spiritual alternatives that exist, and turning the contemplative science enterprise toward a more consistent and robust application to those higher potentialities of the contemplative process is a possibility. And there are other people who are talking about this. And so we're trying to bring that along, because I see that as, a huge potential contributor to the kind of deep change that we need to undergo as individuals and as families and as society, local communities, and as a global, as nations, and as a global humanity.
Mm. Yes, worthy vision. So,
and at this point, it looks kind of touch and go.
Certainly does. Any other parting shots here before we wrap up?
Well, I was thinking, about what I would say in response to your questions here, and I think one of the most important aspects of what I learned in my years in alternative medicine and in medical practice was the critical importance of regimen and the need for regimen to be individualized, and the requirement ultimately that regimen becomes something that becomes a ongoing consideration for people, that there isn't anybody who can give you a regimen that is going to make the be the sort of health supporting lifestyle that you would like to lead without your very active participation in what's an ongoing experiment and is constantly changing, because the body is constantly changing and the circumstances are constantly changing and things are never standing still. And so the responsibility, learning how to become responsible for our daily lifestyle choices is critical and not an easy thing to deliver, but from my perspective, clearly the sort of sine qua non of a healthy physical vehicle for whatever life we want to lead.
Now, how are you defining regimen? Like,
I think regimen is the classical term for it. Lifestyle is another term that is being used, with the understanding that the term lifestyle is also being co-opted by the big brands, because they're trying to sell you the healthy lifestyle, of this Hollywood star or that Hollywood star.
yeah.
Whereas it's a very sober individual undertaking that is something that has to become a part of our daily metabolism, you might say.
things like what we identified early on with the health risk appraisal of not smoking, not drinking, excess, and getting exercise.
And then the positive side of it, you know, not just the nots, but also the
Yeah.
do's.
Mm-hmm. Getting out there and exercise and all the and we've made it into our 70s with a minimum amount of breakdown. I hope my dad made it into his 90s. I'm hoping to do the same.
Yeah, I was able to determine recently by looking at the Johns Hopkins, some tables from the Brady Urologic Clinic at Johns Hopkins, that I'm at risk of living to age 90.
At risk.
That's the way they put it. Given the parameters of my prostate cancer and its removal and how things have proceeded since then, I'm at risk of living to age 90, according to one of the nation's foremost urology clinics.
Well, on that happy note,
that happy note,
end the recording. And it's always a frustration here.